Picture this. You're a new father, 3 days into the most beautiful chapter of your life. Your newborn daughter is sleeping peacefully in her basket. Your wife is recovering from a C-section. And then, at dawn, your front door explodes off its hinges. The HOA president herself storms in with hired goons, lunging for your baby while waving a fake court order she printed after wine night. That's not a nightmare. That's exactly what happened to me. And the only thing that got tested that morning was my self-control not to permanently rearrange her smile. But here's what she didn't know. Every second of her little invasion was streaming live to a secure server monitored by people who don't just call the police. They are the police. The very best kind. This is the story of how a suburban tyrant picked a fight with the wrong veteran, and how her empire of corruption came crashing down around her. Let me take you back to the beginning, to the moment everything changed. The first sound I heard wasn't the splintering wood of our front door being kicked in. It was my daughter, Grace, all of 3 days old, letting out a sharp, piercing cry from the bassinet next to our bed. It was a sound of pure surprise, of a perfect little world being shattered in an instant. My eyes snapped open. I was on my feet before my brain had even processed what came next. A loud, ugly crack echoed through our home as our front door, the one I'd spent an entire weekend painting a cheerful blue, was kicked clean off its hinges. It slammed against the inside wall with a bang that shook the whole house, rattling picture frames and sending a cascade of dust from the ceiling. My first thought, stupid and primal, was about the drywall. I'm going to have to patch that hole. Then the shouting started, and reality caught up with a vengeance. Child Protective Services, we have a warrant. Stay where you are. The voice was female, shrill, dripping with a kind of smug authority I knew all too well. I moved on pure instinct, my body remembering drills my mind had tried so hard to forget. I positioned myself between the bedroom door and my wife, Kylie. She was sitting bolt upright in bed, clutching the sheets to her chest, her face already pale and exhausted from major surgery just days ago. Now it was a mask of pure terror. I could see the stitches in her belly pulling tight under her hospital gown, and a flash of pain crossed her features. "David, what's happening?" she whispered, her voice trembling with fear and confusion. I didn't have an answer. I just held up one hand, a silent command for her to stay put, to stay quiet, to trust me. I could hear them coming down the hallway, heavy boots on our new hardwood floors, the floors we'd so carefully refinished ourselves. More than one person, a lot more. They weren't trying to be quiet. They wanted us to hear them. They wanted us to be afraid. And damn it, it was working. My heart was hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape, but my hands were steady. My breathing was even and controlled. The training takes over in moments like these. You don't think, you just do. You become a machine built for one purpose: protect what's yours. The bedroom door flew open violently, and there she stood, Karen Lowe, the self-proclaimed queen of our little suburban kingdom, the president of the Homeowners Association. She stood framed in the doorway like some kind of monster wearing a pantsuit. Her blonde hair was sprayed into a perfect, immovable helmet that probably violated several fire codes. Her lips were a slash of bright red lipstick, pulled back into a triumphant smirk that made my blood boil. Behind her stood 3 men, big guys dressed in what looked like cheap off-brand tactical gear they'd probably ordered from some sketchy website. They wore black vests and helmets with dark visors that hid their faces, looking less like professional operators and more like a trio of overgrown mall cops who'd won a gift certificate to a military surplus store. One of them was holding a gurney, and to complete this absolute circus, another man stood beside Karen, a scrawny weasel holding a professional-looking video camera with its red recording light blinking like a malevolent eye. He was pointing it right at us, documenting what they thought would be their victory. "There they are," Karen announced, her voice booming with fake concern for the camera. "The unstable father, the incapacitated mother, and the poor, helpless child." She pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at me, her nail polish probably costing more than our monthly grocery bill. "David Martinez, you are a danger to your family. We are here to rescue your daughter." Rescue? The word was so vile, so twisted coming from her mouth that for a second I couldn't even process it. She held up a piece of paper, waving it like it was some kind of holy document. "This is a court order, signed by a judge. We are taking custody of the child." The man with the camera zoomed in on the paper, then panned back to my face, then to Kylie, who was now openly sobbing, her hands protectively covering her stomach where her surgical wounds were still healing. Grace, startled by all the noise and sensing the fear flooding the room, started wailing. It was a heartbreaking, desperate sound that cut through me like a knife. "You can't do this," Kylie cried out, her voice breaking. "She's 3 days old. She needs me. Please." Karen ignored her completely, like she was nothing more than an insect. She nodded to her 3 thugs with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never been told no in her entire privileged life. "Get the baby, and bring the mother. She needs a full psychiatric evaluation." 2 of the goons started moving toward the bassinet where my daughter lay. The third one, the biggest of the 3, started unfolding the gurney, its metal legs clanking ominously on our bedroom floor. That was it. That was the line they should never have crossed. My world weariness, that part of me that had seen the worst of humanity and just wanted to be left alone, evaporated in an instant. The fire took its place. A cold, controlled fury that I hadn't felt in years. They were not touching my daughter. They were not touching my wife. Not while I still had breath in my body. My mind went cold and clear, shifting into combat mode. I stopped seeing the room as a bedroom and started seeing it as a battle space. I cataloged the threats, calculated the angles, identified available weapons. There was a solid oak chair by the window. The lamp on the nightstand had a heavy ceramic base. The two goons approaching the bassinet were clumsy and off balance, clearly not trained professionals. The third one with the gurney was distracted, focused on getting the equipment ready, and Karen, in her arrogance, was standing too close to the action, well within striking distance. "Get away from her," I said. My voice was low, flat, completely devoid of emotion. It didn't sound like me. It sounded like someone I used to be, someone I'd tried to leave behind when I took off the uniform. The goons hesitated for half a second, exchanging uncertain glances. They looked back at Karen for guidance. Suddenly, not so confident. She just laughed, a short, ugly bark that echoed in the room. "Don't listen to him. He's all talk. Get the baby now." The first goon reached a hand toward Grace's bassinet, his fingers just inches from my daughter. In that moment, time seemed to slow down to a crawl. I saw Kylie's eyes widen in absolute horror. I saw the smug grin spreading across Karen's face. I saw the red light of that camera, recording what they thought would be my humiliation. And I moved. I grabbed the back of the oak chair, spun it around in one fluid motion, and swung it hard. Not at the man's body, but at his head. The solid wood connected with his helmet's visor with a crack like a gunshot. The cheap plastic shattered into a spiderweb of cracks, and he staggered backward, clutching his face and howling in pain. One down. Before the second goon could even process what had just happened, I was on him. I didn't have a weapon, so I became one. I drove forward with all my weight, ramming my shoulder into his chest with the force of a linebacker, knocking him completely off balance. As he stumbled backward, arms windmilling, I grabbed his right wrist, the one that was reaching for a taser clipped to his belt. I twisted it hard, bending it back at an angle. Joints aren't meant to go. Bone ground against bone with a sickening crunch. He screamed, a high-pitched shriek of pure agony, and dropped to his knees. His weapon clattered uselessly to the floor. The third goon, the one who'd been setting up the gurney, finally realized what was happening and charged at me like an enraged bull. He was big but slow, all muscle and no technique. I sidestepped his clumsy rush with practiced ease, stuck out my foot at exactly the right moment, and sent him sprawling face-first onto the carpet. He went down with a heavy thud that probably shook the foundation of the house, and knocked a few family photos off the wall. It took less than 5 seconds. 3 goons, neutralized, professional wannabes taken down by simple, effective techniques. Karen's smile had vanished completely, replaced by a look of shocked disbelief. Her mouth was hanging open, her perfectly applied makeup unable to hide the fear creeping into her eyes. The cameraman was frozen in place, his lens still pointed at the scene, capturing every beautiful moment of my little rampage for posterity. I stood there, breathing heavily, adrenaline coursing through my veins. My knuckles were raw and starting to swell. I kicked the taser away from the kneeling man, sending it skittering across the floor, and turned my full attention to Karen Lowe. "Get out of my house," I snarled, taking a step toward her. But just then, I heard the sirens. Not in the distance, getting closer. They were right outside, like they'd been waiting for their cue. Red and blue lights flashed through our bedroom window, painting the walls in strobing colors that made the scene look even more surreal. 2 uniformed sheriff's deputies appeared in the bedroom doorway, guns drawn and pointed directly at me. "Drop to your knees, hands behind your head. Now," they shouted, their voices overlapping in practiced unison. My heart sank like a stone. Of course, Karen, the master manipulator, had planned for this contingency. She'd called them beforehand, spun some story about how I was violent and dangerous, how I would resist their lawful attempt to protect a child. To them, walking into this scene, I was the bad guy. I had just assaulted 3 men who were, as far as they knew, legitimate officers of the court executing a legal warrant. I glanced at Kylie. She was staring at the deputies, her face a mess of tears and confusion and absolute terror. Grace was still crying, her tiny voice growing hoarse. I had no choice. If I resisted, if I fought back, someone might get hurt. Someone innocent. I slowly lowered myself to my knees, my hands shaking with rage and helplessness, and placed them behind my head in the position I'd seen 1,000 times before. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into my wrists, clicking shut with the sound of finality. As they hauled me roughly to my feet, Karen's smirk returned, wider and more venomous than ever. The mask of fear had been replaced by triumphant satisfaction. "See," she said sweetly to the deputies, her voice dripping with false concern. "Violent, unstable, exactly like I told you. Now, please secure the child before he hurts someone else. Before there's a real tragedy here." They started moving toward Kylie, reaching for her, preparing to lift her onto that awful gurney despite her protests. They were going to take her. They were going to take my baby. The goons wheeled Kylie's gurney down our hallway and burst out onto the front walkway, Karen's claws reaching for Grace while the cameraman jogged beside them, trying to get the perfect money shot. Right then, before they could get any further, the entire scene exploded into controlled chaos. A convoy of vehicles screeched to a halt in our driveway. Men in tactical gear, real tactical gear, fanned out with military precision. A flashbang grenade went off with a deafening boom, and suddenly everything was noise and light and movement. I was helpless in handcuffs, being held by the deputies, watching what I thought was my worst nightmare unfolding but what Karen didn't know, what none of them could have possibly known, was that my defense had started long before they ever kicked in that door. Every camera on my property, from the doorbell to the ones carefully hidden in the eaves, wasn't just recording to a local drive that could be seized or destroyed. It was streaming in real time to a secure server, a server monitored 24/7 by a few old friends of mine. The kind of friends who don't just call the police when something goes wrong. They are the police. The very best kind, and as they were pushing me toward their patrol car, my hands still cuffed behind my back, I knew with absolute certainty that help was already here. Everything that had happened that morning, the door, the goons, the fight, the arrests, it wasn't the start of something new. It was the end of a long, miserable road. A road that had begun about a year earlier when Kylie and I first laid eyes on this house and thought we'd found paradise, that it was perfect, or so we thought. A charming little two-bedroom bungalow on a quiet, tree-lined street in a neighborhood called Oakwood Creek. It had a big backyard for the dog we planned to get someday, and a spare room that we dreamed would become a nursery. It was supposed to be our forever home, the place where we could finally put down roots after years of moving from base to base, city to city, never staying anywhere long enough to feel like we truly belonged. After spending my 20s and early 30s moving from one military base to another, all I wanted was peace. Simple, boring, suburban peace. I wanted to wake up in the same bed every single morning. I wanted to know my neighbors' names and wave to them while mowing the lawn. I wanted a life so predictable and boring that the most exciting part of my week was deciding whether to grill burgers or steaks on Saturday afternoon. Kylie wanted the same thing, deserved it even more than I did. She had followed me across the country and around the world. From base housing in North Carolina to apartment rentals in California to temporary lodging in places I still can't talk about. She never complained, never made me feel guilty about the constant upheaval. She just kept making each new place feel like home, no matter how temporary it was. This house was my gift to her, a promise of stability, of a normal, quiet life where she could finally plant a garden and actually see it bloom year after year. We closed on the house in the spring, and the first few weeks were pure bliss. We spent our days painting rooms in cheerful colors, planting flowers in the front beds, and meeting the neighbors. There was an elderly couple across the street who brought us homemade cookies. A young family with twin toddlers lived next door, and their kids would wave at us through the fence. And then there was neighbor Fred. He lived 2 doors down, and he was the first person to really welcome us to Oakwood Creek. Fred was a widower in his late 70s, a retired postal worker with a twinkle in his eye and seemingly endless stories for every occasion. He showed up on our second day with a plate of brownies that were suspiciously perfect, clearly store-bought but lovingly arranged on his late wife's good china, and a wealth of unsolicited but genuinely hilarious advice about lawn care and neighborhood politics. "Don't let the dandelions get a foothold," he'd warned, pointing a bony finger at a patch of yellow weeds sprouting along our driveway. "They look innocent, like cheerful little flowers, but they're invaders, tiny yellow terrorists planning a hostile takeover of your entire lawn. You give them an inch, they'll take your whole yard." We liked Fred immediately. He was quirky and kind, the grandfatherly figure every neighborhood should have, but most don't. He was also the first person to warn us about Karen Lowe, though at the time I didn't understand how serious that warning really was. "She's the queen bee of the HOA," he told us one afternoon while I was struggling with our new riding mower, which had suddenly decided it didn't want to start, "and she takes the queen part very seriously. Been president for almost 20 years now, and she rules this place like it's her own personal fiefdom." He went on to explain that Karen had inherited the position from her father, who'd been the founding president of the Oakwood Creek Homeowners Association back in the 80s. Her husband was a high-powered attorney with political connections all over the city, and they lived in the biggest house on the entire block, a sprawling McMansion that literally looked down on the rest of us peasants. According to Fred, Karen treated the neighborhood like her personal kingdom. "She's got a rule for everything," he'd said, shaking his head with a mixture of amusement and genuine concern. "The exact color of your mailbox, the specific types of flowers you can plant and where you can plant them, the maximum allowable height of your grass, which she measures with an actual ruler. I've seen her do it." I'd laughed it off at the time, not taking it seriously. I'd dealt with my share of petty tyrants and power-hungry bureaucrats during my time in the military. How bad could one middle-aged woman with a clipboard and too much time on her hands really be? I was about to find out exactly how bad, and the answer was worse than I could have possibly imagined. We received our first official violation notice exactly 1 week after moving in. It arrived in a crisp white envelope, left tucked under our doormat like some kind of ominous calling card. Inside, printed on thick, embossed letterhead that probably cost more than our monthly water bill, was a formal violation warning. Our crime: the garden gnome that Kylie's grandmother had given us as a housewarming gift. Apparently, this cheerful little ceramic fellow with his red hat and fishing pole was classified as an unapproved lawn ornament, according to Section C, Paragraph 4 of the HOA bylaws, which I'm sure absolutely nobody had ever read in full. All lawn decorations had to be submitted for approval to something called the Architectural Review Committee, a committee that consisted of, you guessed it, Karen Lowe and 2 of her handpicked cronies. We were given exactly 48 hours to remove the offending gnome or face. A $50 fine. $50. For a garden gnome, I was furious, absolutely livid. Kylie, ever the peacemaker and eternal optimist, just sighed and tried to calm me down. It's silly, I know, she said, putting a gentle hand on my arm. But let's just move him to the backyard. It's not worth fighting over a decoration. We just got here. Let's not make waves yet. I reluctantly agreed, but it left a sour, bitter taste in my mouth. This wasn't about maintaining neighborhood standards or property values. Any fool could see that. This was about power, pure and simple. About establishing dominance and letting us know exactly who was in charge around here. The gnome was just the opening salvo in what would become a long, exhausting war of attrition. And that little gnome was just the beginning of our nightmare in Oakwood Creek. Over the next few months, the violation notices started piling up like bills we couldn't pay. We got fined because our garbage can was visible from the street for exactly 2 hours after the trash had been collected. Even though the truck had come early and we were both at work, we received a formal warning because the brand of mulch we'd used in our flower beds, bought from a regular hardware store, wasn't on the mysteriously secret approved vendor list. We were cited for parking our car in our own driveway, at an angle that was deemed aesthetically displeasing to the neighborhood. Character. Each notice came with escalating fines and increasingly ridiculous justifications. It was clear that Karen had made us her special project. Her latest victims, in what I would later learn, was a decades-long pattern of targeted harassment. That this was our life in Oakwood Creek, a beautiful prison where every tiny decision could result in a fine, a threat, or a confrontation. And it was only going to get worse. Much, much worse. Because what we didn't know yet was that Karen's harassment campaign wasn't just about power or control. It was about money. A lot of money, and our little house, the place we'd chosen for its peace and quiet, was standing directly in the way of her biggest score yet. The war was just beginning, and we had no idea how deep the corruption ran or how far Karen Lowe was willing to go to get what she wanted. But we were about to find out, and the lesson would nearly destroy everything we held dear. The aftermath of the raid was pure chaos. 1 minute, I was standing there in handcuffs, watching my entire world fall apart, convinced that Karen had won. The next minute, everything changed. A black, unmarked van and 2 county SWAT trucks screeched to a halt in our driveway, their tires leaving black marks on the pavement. But these weren't ordinary cops. Responding to a domestic disturbance, the men who emerged from those vehicles wore matte black tactical vests with bold yellow letters stamped across them. Navy. These weren't mall cops or weekend warriors. They were Reserve SEAL instructors on loan to the county's elite SWAT team. These guys were the real deal, and I recognized their movement patterns immediately. They'd been trained by the same people who trained me. They moved with fluid, terrifying efficiency, stacking up on my broken front door with practiced precision. A flashbang grenade went off with a deafening boom and a blinding flash of light that made everyone freeze. Then they flooded into the house like water through a broken dam. It was over, in seconds, a masterclass in controlled violence. The deputies who had arrested me were stunned into complete inaction, their hands frozen on their weapons. Karen's remaining goon, the one who'd been wheeling the gurney, was face down on the ground with a knee in his back before he could even process what was happening. My old platoon mate, Sergeant Rick Downing, now the head of the county's SWAT team, ripped the phony warrant out of a bewildered deputy's hand. He took one look at it, then turned his cold gaze on Karen. "This is a forgery," he said, his voice dangerously calm in the way only truly dangerous men can be. He pulled out his phone and showed it to the senior deputy on the scene, the one who'd been giving orders. "And this is a live feed from the cameras on this property. We have video of you kicking in that door. We have audio of you admitting there's no legitimate CPS case. We also have bank transfers showing a payment from a development company to this so-called CPS agent's personal account." He pointed at the weaselly man with the camera, who now looked like he was about to vomit all over our hardwood floors. The world turned right side up again in an instant. The handcuffs came off my wrists and were promptly slapped onto Karen's instead. She didn't scream or protest or try to run. She just stood there, staring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred that could have melted steel. Her husband, who had apparently been waiting in his luxury sedan down the street, ready to celebrate their victory, was arrested the moment he came to see what all the commotion was about. The goons, the fake CPS agent, even the cameraman, they were all taken into custody. An ambulance arrived, and real paramedics, actual medical professionals, finally attended to Kylie and Grace. They checked them over thoroughly, making sure they were physically okay, though the psychological damage would take much longer to heal. As I watched the police transport van pull away with Karen and her entire crew inside, their faces pressed against the wire-reinforced windows, I felt a surge of triumph wash over me. We'd won. We'd actually beaten her. Justice had prevailed. But that victory, that moment of relief, was painfully short-lived. The very next day, while I was still trying to process everything that had happened, I got a call from Rick. His voice on the phone was tight, controlled, the way it got when he had bad news to deliver. "You're not going to like this, brother," he said. "What is it?" I asked, though part of me already knew. "She's out. Posted bail this morning." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Out? How is that even possible? She's facing kidnapping charges, fraud, conspiracy, assault. How does someone walk away from that? Rick sighed heavily on the other end of the line. The DA's office is stalling. Her husband's law firm posted a 7-figure bond like it was pocket change. And get this, they're talking about treating the whole thing as a complex civil dispute that got out of hand. They're not even pushing for the serious charges. It's like they're afraid of her. My blood ran cold. Of course, her husband wasn't just some lawyer. He was a major player in the city, with connections that ran deep into the political establishment. They had money, real money, and connections to match. The kind of power that makes felony charges disappear, like morning fog. But then the second part of Karen's attack began, and it was even more insidious than the physical raid. This was a war for public opinion, for hearts and minds, and she was playing it perfectly. A local news blog, one known for sensationalist clickbait and questionable ethics, posted an article that made my stomach turn. The headline read, "Local HOA President Attacked by Unstable Veteran." It was filled with quotes from anonymous neighbors who described me as aggressive, threatening, mentally unbalanced. It painted Karen as a concerned community leader who was only trying to protect a helpless infant from a dangerous father and a mentally fragile mother who couldn't care for herself, let alone a newborn. It was a masterpiece of character assassination, every word carefully chosen to destroy us. My military service, something I'd been proud of, was twisted into evidence that I was a ticking time bomb with PTSD. Kylie's completely normal postpartum exhaustion was spun into a narrative of severe mental illness and incompetence. The article even included a photo of our house with a red circle around our front door, like we were criminals. The story spread like wildfire across social media. Within hours, our names and faces were everywhere. People who didn't know us, who didn't know a single thing about the real situation, were leaving vile comments, calling me a monster, saying Kylie was an unfit mother, demanding that Grace be taken away for her own safety. Our friends and families started getting calls from reporters looking for dirt, for any detail that could keep the story alive. Even Kylie's mom, who lived 3 states away and had nothing to do with any of this, saw the story and called us in tears, asking what was happening to her daughter. It was an absolute nightmare. We had won the physical battle in our bedroom that morning, but we were losing the war for our reputations, for our peace of mind, for our very identities. Karen was no longer just a neighborhood bully with a clipboard. She had transformed into a media-savvy monster with a team of expensive lawyers and public relations experts behind her. She was turning herself into the victim and painting me as the villain in a story that thousands of people were believing without question. I felt a kind of despair I hadn't experienced since the darkest days of my deployments overseas. I had faced enemies with guns and bombs and understood how to fight them, but I had no idea how to fight an enemy armed with lies and innuendo, with lawyers and spin doctors. The legal system, the very thing that was supposed to protect innocent people, was being manipulated and weaponized against us. That the initial triumph of seeing her in handcuffs curdled into a sickening realization. She was going to get away with it. She was going to destroy our lives, piece by piece, and she would do it all with a smile on her face. Wrapped in the protective blanket of her wealth and influence, I looked at Kylie. One evening, as she tried to breastfeed Grace but was shaking too hard to do it properly, I looked at our daughter, sleeping peacefully in her bassinet, completely oblivious to the storm raging around her tiny perfect head. The protective fire in my gut roared back to life, hotter and more intense than ever. If the law couldn't give us justice, then the law was no longer the answer. I couldn't just defend my family anymore, playing by rules that only applied to people like us. I had to go on the offensive, and I knew instinctively that this fight wouldn't be won with evidence presented in a courtroom and testimony given under oath. It would be won with secrets and shadows, in the gray areas where the system couldn't reach. The days that followed were some of the darkest of my entire life. The legal system continued to fail us at every turn. The media continued to crucify us with lies. Kylie became a ghost in our own home, afraid to answer the phone, afraid to look at social media, afraid to even go outside. She would just sit for hours, holding Grace close to her chest, rocking back and forth with empty eyes that broke my heart. One evening, she finally broke down completely. "We have to move. David," she sobbed, her whole body trembling with exhaustion and fear. "We have to sell the house and just go. Disappear. Go somewhere. She can never find us. It's not worth it anymore. She's going to destroy us if we stay." I held her, my own heart breaking for her, for what this was doing to her. Part of me, the part that was world-weary and just desperately wanted peace, completely agreed with her. Running seemed like the only sane option left. We could sell everything, pack up, disappear into another state, and leave the monster of Oakwood Creek far behind us. But another part of me, the fiery protective part that refused to be beaten, knew that running wasn't really an answer. It was a surrender. If we ran now, Karen would win completely. She would get our house. She would get her condo development built. And she would move on to terrorize the next family that dared to stand in her way. There would always be another victim. And what kind of life would we have? Always looking over our shoulders. Living in fear that she might find us somehow, that her reach might extend wherever we went. What kind of lesson would that teach our daughter as she grew up? That when you're faced with a bully, someone who uses power to hurt people, you just run and hide. No, I couldn't accept that. This was my home. This was my family. And I would go to any length, cross any line, to defend it. That night, after Kylie and the baby were finally asleep, I went for a long walk through our neighborhood. I needed to think, to clear my head. I found myself standing in front of neighbor Fred's house. His lights were still on, and through the window I could see him sitting in an old armchair, staring at a framed photograph on the mantelpiece. I hesitated for a moment, then knocked on his door. He opened it immediately, like he'd been expecting me, and ushered me inside without a single word. He poured me a generous glass of whiskey, and we sat in heavy silence for several minutes. "She's going to get away with it, isn't she?" I finally said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Fred took a long, slow sip of his own drink. He looked over at the photograph on the mantel, his eyes distant and filled with old pain. "That's my son," he said, his voice thick with a deep, ancient sorrow. "Michael, he was a good boy, a smart boy. Started his own landscaping business right out of high school. Built it from the ground up with his own two hands." He paused, lost in memories that clearly still haunted him. He got the contract for maintaining the common areas in this neighborhood. He was so proud of that contract, thought it would make his business legitimate. But he made one fatal mistake. He underbid Karen's preferred contractor, some cousin of hers who did shoddy work for inflated prices. She never forgave him for that. Never. Fred went on to tell me a story that was chillingly, terrifyingly familiar. It started with petty complaints about Michael's work. Then came fines for parking his work truck on the street for 10 minutes too long. Citations for his crew starting work 5 minutes too early in the morning. Then Karen started withholding payments from the HOA, claiming his work wasn't up to her impossible standards. She buried him in paperwork, in legal threats, in constant harassment. She bled his small business completely dry, Fred said, his voice cracking with emotion. He lost everything. The business, his house, his savings, his reputation. He ended up declaring bankruptcy at 28 years old. The shame of it, the failure, it was too much for him to bear. Fred pointed a shaky finger at the photograph of the young man with the hopeful smile. That was taken exactly 1 week before he took his own life. In the letter he left behind, he wrote her name, Karen Lowe. He said she was a poison that had seeped into every part of his life, until there was nothing good left. Until he couldn't see any way out. I stared at Fred, absolutely horrified by what I was hearing. This wasn't just about greed or petty power games for Karen. This was a deliberate pattern of destruction spanning decades. She wasn't just a bully. She was responsible for a man's death, and she'd face no consequences whatsoever. All my hesitation, all my doubts about what I had to do, they vanished completely in that moment. The moral crossroads I'd been standing at became a straight, clear path forward. "I'm so sorry, Fred," I said, my voice rough with emotion. "I'm so incredibly sorry for your loss." He shook his head, tears now flowing freely down his weathered cheeks. "Don't be sorry," he said, his voice gaining a new, hard edge I'd never heard before. "Be angry. Be smart. Don't let her do to you and your family what she did to my boy. You have a wife and daughter to protect. You fight her with everything you have. You hear me? Everything." I nodded, a cold, clear resolve settling deep in my bones. I finished my whiskey in one burning gulp and went home with a new sense of purpose. I walked into my home office, sat down at my desk, and pulled out my phone. I scrolled through my contacts to a name I hadn't called in years, a name associated with a part of my life I had tried so hard to leave behind, a life of shadows and secrets and morally gray areas that existed. Outside the normal rules, the phone rang twice before a gravelly voice answered. "Well, it's been a while." "Yeah, it's me," I replied. "I need a favor, the kind we don't talk about on an open line." There was a long pause. "I thought you were out of the game, Dave. Thought you'd gone full civilian." I looked over at the baby monitor on my desk, at the peaceful image of Grace sleeping in her crib, completely innocent and trusting. They pulled me back in, I said quietly, and this time, it's personal. That phone call was the first domino. My contact, a man known only as Echo in our old circles, was a ghost in the digital world. A master of cyber warfare who could slip through any security system like it wasn't even there. He didn't ask unnecessary questions. He just said simply, "Tell me what you need." And I did. I told him everything about Karen, her husband, the fake development company, years of harassment, the attempted kidnapping. I sent him my entire dossier, every log, every photo, every second of video from my security cameras. He went to work immediately, and he wasn't working alone. He pulled in other members of our old unit, guys with specialties in financial tracking, asset location, and what they euphemistically called social engineering. While they started their digital deep dive into Karen's life, I focused on the ground game. My first target was the HOA's finances. As a homeowner and DUS-paying member, I was legally entitled to review them. I sent a formal registered letter to the HOA board, requesting a complete audit of all financial records. The panic was immediate and obvious. I got a blustering letter back from her husband's law firm, telling me my request was improper and burdensome, and threatening legal action if I persisted. That defensive overreaction was all the confirmation I needed. They were definitely hiding something big. While they were stonewalling me legally. Echo's team was already inside their servers through the back door. What they found was absolutely staggering. For years, maybe decades, Karen had been using the HOA as her personal piggy bank. Association fees were being systematically funneled into a shell corporation registered under her maiden name. She was using community money to pay for her personal landscaping, her pool maintenance, even her property taxes. She had embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years. But that was just the tip of a massive iceberg. The real dirt was connected to her husband and his development company. It turned out the company was essentially a front, a sophisticated money laundering operation for some very unsavory clients with connections to organized crime. The condo project they wanted to build on our land and the surrounding properties wasn't just about real estate development, it was about washing millions of dollars in dirty money through legitimate-looking construction projects. Our little house, our dream home, was standing directly in the way of a massive criminal enterprise worth tens of millions of dollars. The attempted kidnapping of our daughter suddenly made a terrifying kind of sense. It wasn't just a desperate act by a petty neighborhood tyrant. It was a calculated business move. If they could get us declared mentally unstable and unfit parents, they could potentially seize control of our property through legal channels and clear the final obstacle to their project. The information kept pouring in. A digital avalanche of evidence. Offshore bank accounts in the Cayman Islands. Encrypted emails discussing payments and deals. Dummy corporations layered on top of each other. It was an incredibly complex web of deceit and criminality, all carefully orchestrated by Karen and her husband over many years. But we also discovered something else. Something that explained how she'd operated with such complete impunity for so long. Karen wasn't just powerful because of her husband's money and connections. She was a master blackmailer who'd been collecting dirt on people for decades. Echo's team found a hidden, heavily encrypted folder on her personal computer with the file name Insurance. Inside was a treasure trove of compromising information on nearly every person of influence in our city. A city councilman's gambling debts, a building inspector's extramarital affair, a judge's hidden addiction to prescription painkillers. She had been systematically collecting secrets for years, using them like weapons to bend officials to her will. This was how she operated with such complete impunity. She wasn't just greasing palms with money. She literally had a gun to everyone's head, ready to pull the trigger and destroy their lives if they didn't comply. We had it all now. A mountain of evidence that could not only send Karen and her husband to prison for the rest of their lives, but could also dismantle an entire citywide network of corruption. The question was, what to do with it? How to use it without getting buried ourselves. We couldn't just hand everything over to the local police or the district attorney. Karen clearly had them in her pocket, owned them through blackmail or bribery or both. They would bury the evidence and expose us as the sources, and we'd be destroyed. We needed a coordinated plan, a way to detonate all this information simultaneously in a way that no one could possibly cover up or contain. We decided on a three-pronged attack that would hit from multiple directions at once. First, we packaged all the financial crimes, the embezzlement, tax evasion, and money laundering evidence, and prepared to send it anonymously to the IRS's Criminal Investigation Division. They were federal agents who couldn't be intimidated by local politics or blackmail. Second, we prepared to leak all the salacious blackmail material to that same muckraking news blogger who had gleefully smeared my name. Let him tear down the very people he'd been unknowingly protecting. It was poetic justice. Third, and most importantly, we would use the evidence of the kidnapping conspiracy and the criminal enterprise to get the direct attention of the FBI's Public Integrity Section. For a week straight, my office became a war room and command center. I barely slept, fueled by endless coffee and a burning need for justice. Kylie knew something major was happening. She saw the light under my office door at all hours. But she didn't ask questions. She just looked at me with a new expression, one that mixed lingering fear with fragile, tentative hope. We were hours away from launching our coordinated digital assault when Fred came to my door late one night. He looked pale, drawn, conflicted. He sat down heavily in my living room and told me something that changed everything again. "I haven't been completely honest with you, David," he confessed. "My guidance, the things I told you about investigating the HOA's books, about her husband's business, it wasn't random neighborly advice. I've been gently pushing you, guiding you toward things I already knew." Fred's real story came tumbling out. After his son's suicide, he hadn't just grieved. He'd spent nearly a decade methodically gathering information on Karen Lowe, learning about public records, corporate filings, digging into backgrounds. He'd been slowly assembling a case against her, piece by painful piece. But he was just an old man without resources or skills to do anything with the information. "Then you moved in," he said, looking at me intently. "I saw the way you carried yourself. I heard you were former military. I saw the fire in your eyes when you stood up to her. I knew you were the ally I'd been waiting for all these years." But that wasn't the real revelation. From inside his jacket, he pulled out a small, worn leather-bound book that looked like an old diary. "This is Karen's father's personal ledger," he explained. "Decades of extortion, blackmail, illegal deals, all meticulously recorded in his own handwriting. It's a complete roadmap to half a century of corruption in this town." Inside were names and figures that made everything click into place, including details of a hush money payment made decades ago to cover up a hit-and-run accident committed by our current district attorney's father, an accident that had crippled a child and been completely buried. Suddenly, everything made perfect sense. The reason the DA was protecting Karen, dragging his feet on charges, wasn't just about money or influence. It was direct, personal blackmail. She was holding his entire career, his family's legacy, hostage. Our plan to go through any local authorities was worse than flawed. It was a death trap. We had to go over everyone's heads. We had to get this ledger into federal hands without anyone in the state knowing. The game had become infinitely more dangerous, but also infinitely more winnable. I coordinated with Echo to set up a direct meeting with his FBI contact in the public integrity section. But first, I needed to keep Karen in place long enough for the feds to arrive. I needed one final confrontation, and I had the perfect bait, her own massive ego. I had my lawyer draft a humiliating settlement offer, a complete surrender where I admitted to being unstable, apologized publicly to Karen, and agreed to sell her our house for her original insulting price. To any sane person, it would look too good to be true. But Karen wasn't sane. She was an egomaniac who couldn't resist the idea of me crawling back to her. Broken and defeated, she agreed to meet at the HOA Community Center. She wanted an audience for her final victory. It was perfect. The night of the meeting was cold and tense. I walked in alone, wearing a wire that was feeding directly to the FBI team positioned nearby. Karen sat at the head of a long table like a queen, her husband, behind her, two new goons by the door. Well, Mr. Martinez," she said with venomous satisfaction. "I knew you'd see reason eventually." I let her gloat, let her talk. I needed her confession on tape. She bragged about controlling the DA, about how people always listen when you know their secrets. She casually mentioned her son Michael's death like it was nothing. Then she admitted the condos were a washing machine for dirty money and that our house was the last piece of the puzzle. Just as she pushed the settlement papers toward me, the doors burst open. FBI agents in blue jackets filed in with calm, professional precision. The lead agent walked straight to Karen. "Karen Lowe, you are under arrest for racketeering, conspiracy to commit fraud, and extortion." The look on Karen's face as they cuffed her, as her entire world collapsed in seconds, was something I'll never forget. Pure shock giving way to hatred. They arrested her husband too, right there, announcing they had warrants for his entire law firm. It was clean, precise, final. 6 months later, I'm sitting on my front porch swing, the one Karen once tried to find me for. Grace is in my arms, smiling those big gummy grins that make everything worth it. The house is ours, free and clear. Karen and her husband were denied bail, facing charges that will keep them in prison for life. The DA resigned in disgrace. The FBI cleaned out half the city government. The HOA was dissolved. The neighbors formed a new voluntary association with Fred as president. They built a community garden where the old community center stood, with a bench dedicated to Michael and all of Karen's victims. Kylie comes out with iced tea, smiling a real smile again. "It's quiet," she says. "Yeah," I reply. "It is. Peace isn't something you find. It's something you build. And sometimes you have to burn down the old world to build a new one." Looking at my wife, my daughter, and my home, I know it was all worth it. The fight is over. We're safe. We're home. And this time, it's forever.